Good morning, Dr. McClelland. Can you see me?
Yes, I can, and I can hear you.
Good. My apologies to you and to those who are watching for the slight delay in starting this morning. It's been due at this end to making sure that we have the documents properly sorted out. We had a problem yesterday with document imaging, which I hope will not be repeated. I gather that there may be problems on the internet connection with you today. I hope again that doesn't transpire, but if it does, I would ask you and those who are watching remotely to bear with us. You'll gather from what I've said already that there are just a few people here in Aldwych in the centre of London. You are, I think, on the western outskirts of Edinburgh, are you?
That's correct.
Whereabouts are you?
I'm in a building called the Jack Copeland Centre, which is the headquarters of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service.
And who is there with you?
There's nobody in the room with me. My Central Legal Office lawyer is present in the building, but in a separate room.
Now, there will be breaks during the course of your evidence to us. During those breaks, the rule is, and I say this to everyone at some stage, generally early on, that they must not discuss the evidence which they have given or think they may yet be asked to give with anyone, whoever that person is. They can talk about anything else they like. Now, in a moment, Mary is going to ask you to take the oath, and after that, Miss Richards will be asking you the questions. Mary.
Please state your full name.
David Brian Lorimer McClelland.
Could you take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
Swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Dr. McClelland, can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
I'm just going to start with a brief overview of your professional career. You studied, I understand, at Edinburgh University.
Yes.
And then throughout the 1970s, you undertook a range of clinical research and academic work in Edinburgh and in the Netherlands.
That's correct.
You then joined the Edinburgh and South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Service in 1977 as a consultant.
Yes.
And was the director of the service at that stage, of the SEBTS service at that stage, Dr. Cash?
Yes.
And then in 1979, you became the director of South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Service when Dr. Cash became the National Medical Director for SNBTS.
That's correct.
As I understand it, you stood down as director in 2002, but continued to have a strategic and consultancy role there between 2002 and 2004.
That's correct.
Between 2004 and 2008, you were the chair of JPAC, which is the acronym for the Joint Blood Transfusion and Tissue Transplantation Professional Advisory Committee, or something like that, if I've got it right.
Yes, something like that, yeah.
And I'll come back towards the end of your evidence to ask you a little more about that. You also, between 2002 and 2009, worked with the SNBTS Better Blood Transfusion team. Is that correct?
Yes.
And again, that's an area of your work that we'll come back to towards the end of your evidence, so probably tomorrow sometime. And then you retired in April of 2009.
Yes.
Now, we'll see as I explore a number of issues with you, Dr. McClelland, that you have participated in a fairly wide range of committees working groups and so on relating to blood transfusion during your career. Those included EAGA, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS.
Yes.
And you were a member of EAGA from its inception in early 1985, I think.
That's correct.
You were also a member for a period of time of SACTI, so the Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were also on the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissue for Transplant, and that was a role you took over from Dr. Mitchell in October 1995.
Yes, that's correct.
Again, there are a number of other committees and working groups which we'll touch on as we explore some of your evidence. You gave evidence to the Penrose inquiry on a number of occasions orally, and also submitted a number of written witness statements to the Penrose inquiry.
That's right.
Now, I want to start then by asking you about the centre in Edinburgh and the blood transfusion service for the South East region. First of all, can you assist us with the geographical area that the service that you were director of covered or was responsible for?
Yes, it covered Edinburgh, the Borders region of Scotland, and approximately the southern half of Fife across the river.
I'm going to ask you to look at a document with me. You referred to it in your witness statement. It's I think the job description for the post of director that you took up in 1979. Sally, could we have PRSE 40950, please? So we can see this is Post of Director for the South East Scotland Regional Blood Transfusion Service. And then we have a job description. The Director will have overall responsibility for ensuring that the full range of activities in the service are carried out efficiently. And the next paragraph refers to overall responsibility for teaching and research programmes of the service. And then the third paragraph, the Director will be expected to share with other transfusion directors the responsibilities involved in coordinating the national service as a whole, and then the Director will deputise for the National Medical Director, so that was then later Professor Cash, in his absence, in coordinating investigations of untoward reactions associated with the administration of blood products prepared at the Protein Fractionation Centre. So that, I think, is a broad description of your job as Director of SEBTS.
Yes, it is.
If we go over the page, I think then can have some more information about the regional service itself. This is entitled Memorandum of Information. If we just look at the first paragraph to understand the organisation of the service, it says this: early in their development, the regional transfusion services were linked to form the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association, the executive committee of which exercised overall control. So that was before your time, I think, Dr. McClelland.
A long time before my time. Yeah.
And then, since reorganisation of the NHS in Scotland on the 1st of April 1974, the SNBTS was formed as one of the divisions of the Common Services Agency, which was established to administer those services within the NHS which could better be provided for Scotland by one organisation rather than by each of the 15 health boards. So just pausing there, Dr. McClelland, if you can help us to understand the position. We've heard evidence in relation to England and Wales to the effect that the regional transfusion centres in England and Wales were essentially accountable to their individual regional health authority, the equivalent of the health boards in Scotland. That wasn't the position in Scotland, as we see from this.
No, it wasn't. It never was the position, actually, because prior to the 1974 Act, the Reorganisation Act in the Scottish Health Service, the BTS was nominally still supported by voluntary contributions and was, in a sense, acting more like a charity, although it increasingly required financial subsidies, which came from central government funds, I guess, through the Scottish Home and Health Department. So it has never been either financed through or accountable to individual health boards. It's perhaps worth pointing out that the population of Scotland was less than that of several large English cities, so this possibly wasn't an unreasonable arrangement.
Dr. McClelland, we've heard again from directors, regional transfusion directors in England and Wales, that one of the disadvantages of the system in England and Wales was that in terms of funding, the regional transfusion centre, in a sense, had to compete with other health services for funding from its individual regional health authority. In Scotland, were there particular advantages or disadvantages to the system that you've described and we see set out here, whereby you weren't funded by the individual health boards, but were an agency or division of the Common Services Agency?
I think it was a bit of a mixed picture. I mean, reading some of the papers that the inquiry has provided me with, there are examples where regional health authorities have actually acted promptly and effectively in funding important developments in the regional transfusion services, as they were. Obviously, there are other examples when that did not happen. The Common Services Agency, which has now changed its name, was quite a bureaucratic outfit, and of course there was also a question of competition with many other services, and I would say the relationship between the transfusion directors and the Common Services Agency was never an easy one, and there were frequent occasions in which not only was funding not allocated, but during the meetings with officers of the agency and the department, claims were, some extravagant claims were made that what the transfusion service was demanding was frankly unreasonable and excessive on occasions when it was actually, in my view, certainly necessary expenditure to provide a safe and effective service. So it was a mixed blessing.
And we may pick up on some of those themes as we carry on. If we just go towards the bottom half of this page, please. We can see the third paragraph records that the transfusion directors meet regularly to discuss matters of common interest, usually with the National Medical Director and the Chair. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then we see the SNBTS comprises a headquarters unit, 5 regional transfusion services and a protein fractionation centre. Again, I'll come back to some aspects of that. Where was the headquarters unit based?
The headquarters unit, as I recall, was based at the start, after the reorganisation, was based in a small porta cabin on the grounds of the Protein Fractionation Centre at Liberton, outside Edinburgh. And as it says in the job description here, it was a tiny organisation. There was the National Medical Director. The small supporting staff was actually the National Administrator and 1 assistant, and that was it. Of course, over the years, the managerial component, financial, the sort of back office side of the organisation grew and grew and grew, and more porta cabins had to be added to accommodate them.
And then if we go to the top of the next page, we can see the locations of the various regional services. If we just look at that table at the top of the page, please, thank you. I won't go through all of them. We've got the 5 services set out there. The South East Service, which you took over in 1979, was based in Edinburgh. And I'll come on to the facilities of the service there in due course. If we then go over the page, please, Sally. We've got a heading there, South East Scotland Regional Blood Transfusion Service, general information. The South East Service is responsible for the supply of blood and blood products to a population of 1.2 million. The health services for the area involved are provided by the Lothian Borders and 5 health boards. Headquarters of the regional service with its associated laboratories are sited in the Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh. And then there's a description under the heading accommodation on the bottom half of the page of the facilities and the anticipation of a move. Again, I'll come back to that in a few minutes, Dr. McClelland, when we look at an inspection that took place in the early 1980s. Yeah. We go to the next page. We've got a sense of the staffing arrangements there. I won't go through the full detail, but we can see the staffing numbers set out and the mix of medical and other staff. And then the bottom of the page lists the full-time medical staff filling posts at that time. And then if we can go over the page, I just want to explore with you the various divisions of the service. So if we look bottom half of the page, we've got the heading Service Functional Information. We've got the Donor Management Division. Is it right to understand that's essentially concerned with recruiting donors, planning donor sessions, coordinating the donor sessions?
Yes.
And I'll ask you how that changed over time in due course. We go to the next page. The Blood Component Division. So that's the division concerned essentially with the processing of the donations, the preparation of platelets, cryoprecipitants, etc. And I'll ask you a little more again about that. The Blood Bank Division, can you just help us understanding a little more how that worked? Obviously, the individual hospitals changed over time, but broadly speaking, what was the blood banking arrangement?
Well, this was one of the features of the Edinburgh Centre, which was also shared with Aberdeen, Inverness and Dundee, that those regional centres provided a function to the hospital which is typically, and I think almost universally in England, provided by the hospital as part of what would now be called the pathology service. So it meant that the provision of, for the Royal Infirmary and the other major hospitals in Edinburgh, if a doctor required blood for a patient, the request would go to the transfusion service. The transfusion service would obtain, the request would go with a sample of the patient's blood. The transfusion service blood bank laboratory would carry out the compatibility tests to ensure that they provided blood that was matched to that patient's blood types, etc. And they would then, depending on the details of the request, they would either hold it for the patient or they would send it to the hospital destination where it was to be transfused. So this was a function that was unusual in most of the UK transfusion services.
And then we can see the next division is an immunology division, which amongst other matters dealt with the issue of blood grouping. And then if we go over the page, we've got a range of other divisions. Just draw attention to the microbiology division, so that's the first underlined heading. And at that point in time, we're told hepatitis and VDRL testing dominate the activities of this division, as well as bacterial surveillance. And again, obviously, that will have changed over time, and we'll explore that in due course.
That was restricted then to hepatitis B testing.
If we could then go to page 10 of this document, please, Sally. there's a heading, Relations with the Lothian Health Board, at the top of the page. It says, for many years, the relationship between the Regional Transfusion Service and the Lothian Health Board has been close, amicable and productive. And then it explains that there's joint financing for certain services, and then a formal arrangement exists whereby all human blood products are obtained and issued by the Regional Transfusion Centre, including those from commercial sources. I'll come back to that particular issue, Dr. McClelland, later. Yeah. Was your experience as director that the relationship with the Lothian Health Board was close, amicable and productive as described here?
I wouldn't have been quite so fulsome about it, but it worked. It became increasingly difficult as time went on. The pressure for a lot of these services that were rather unusually provided by the transfusion centre, the pressure to move those into the orbit of the hospital, I think was always in the background, and eventually I think that has now largely happened.
And then,
but the relationships were not bad.
And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we can just see that a heading, Relationship to SMBTS Headquarters Unit. In common with all regional directors, the successful candidate will participate in those activities in which national policies and programmes are devised and discussed. And I want to pick that theme up with you a little later this morning. So that's an overview of the structure of SEBTS when you took over the job of director in 1979. Can you just give us, before we look at some documentation relating to it, a broad description of the physical facilities and problems with the physical facilities at the centre in Edinburgh in 1979?
Yes, certainly. The main building was sandwiched, which had been, I think, part of it dated from probably the 30s, and then there had been a significant extension in around about 1952 or something like that. It was sandwiched between two ward blocks of an old Nightingale hospital. If you are familiar with the design of these, they had a great long corridor projecting ward blocks out with big space between them for very good microbiological reasons. So the BTS main building was a sort of squeezed in between two of these blocks, and it was, even when I went there, it was small, inadequate space was available for most of the functions. It had changed in the 1950s from operating exclusively with glass bottles. And the early 1950s extension actually included a large area, a large room, which was the bottle washing plant. By the time I'd arrived, that had been converted into laboratories. And the service had transferred completely to using single-use plastic bags, which opened the possibility of producing plasma, platelets, and cryoprecipitate, which really had not been practicable before. And that required accommodation for the separation and centrifugation procedures, which I'm sure you'll go into more detail about. That was accommodated in a basement of an old Georgian building, which was probably 300 yards away from the main centre, where was the blood bank, etc. The accommodation was terrible. It was quite inappropriate, quite inadequate, in ways that were detailed relatively politely, actually, in the 1982 Medicines Inspector's report. The donor centre was in the same building on a higher level, and was again really inadequate for for purpose, for the traffic that it bore. And I can remember occasions when we had to close the donor centre because the stairs more or less collapsed. So it was very, that part of the accommodation was really quite awful.
Is that, may I ask, the location in Archibald Place?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
So that just to the west of the what was then the Royal Infirmary building?
Yes, it was actually it was threatened with demolition actually for the building of the phase 1 of the new Royal Infirmary. And eventually these little run of Georgian buildings survived on appeal, as it were. And the first large phase 1 of the new Royal was built behind it. And later, as you will come to, we occupied accommodation there.
Thank you.
And if we look at a document you produced in 1981, Dr. McClelland, it's SBTS 0000227_050, please. The document is dated on the last page. We don't need to go to the last page. 20th of May 1981. It's headed Future Accommodation for Edinburgh and South East Scotland Regional Blood Transfusion Service. Proposal for allocating additional area in Phase 1 Royal Infirmary to the BTS. And then we can see you describe the present plans for the future accommodation of BTS and say in paragraph 1, the accommodation at present allocated to the BTS in Phase 1 was originally intended to provide all the space required by the Regional Transfusion Centre. It was already obvious in 1973 that the area available to the BTS in Phase 1 was quite inadequate to cope with the expanding service. The next page, oh, sorry, in fact, I should just read the rest of that, if we keep that on screen, Sally. The rest of that paragraph first. Since that period, there's been continuous expansion, particularly in relation to blood component production. This trend is certain to continue for several years if the BTS is to meet the government's stated objective of achieving national self-sufficiency in supplies of plasma products. The next paragraph refers to the Medicines Inspectorate, which we'll come on to in a moment. And then paragraph 3 explains that once it became obvious that the accommodation allocated to the BTS in Phase 1 was insufficient, bids were made for space for the BTS in the Phase 2 building. And then paragraph 4 explains that because of long delays anticipated in the completion of Phase 2, it's been obvious for several years there was an inescapable need for an interim solution. And you refer there to a plan developed by Dr. Cash. And then if we go over the page, you describe in paragraph 7 a sequence, sorry, page 2. Sally. Thank you. Paragraph 7, you describe a current intended sequence of moves. I don't need to go through the details of that. And then bottom of the page, you set out an alternative proposal for the future accommodation of the BTS. Now, I don't propose to go through the specific details of it, but can you just outline to us in broad terms what Phase 1 was, what Phase 2 was, and what actually happened, as a matter of fact?
Well, Phase 1 of the new Royal Infirmary was built, and after that, there had been, I should preface this by saying there had been an interminable debate among medical professionals and the health department and about the location of a new Royal Infirmary. And this, there were obviously professional camps involved and many other considerations. Went on for years. The Phase 1 of the new Royal Infirmary was built at a point when a decision seemed to have been made to redevelop on the original hospital site, which was central, very, good for patient access and so on. But obviously there were some space limitations. the phase 1 building was completed, and the debate raged again, and eventually led to a decision to build the new hospital, essentially all of the new hospital, on a new site on the south, in the south of Edinburgh, a place called Little France. So the phase 1 building was potentially redundant. When it was designed, it's a very big building. I can't tell you the floor area, but it's a very substantial building. One whole level of it was empty when the rest of the building was occupied, because that was intended as staff changing for the entire personnel of the whole new Royal Infirmary when it was complete. And that was the space that we had hoped when it became evident that the phase 2 on the old Royal Infirmary site was not going to be built. We could see that there was no obvious candidate for occupying that large space, and we made strenuous bids to get part of it to re-accommodate those bits of the transfusion service that were so poorly accommodated. That again was ultimately rejected. So the plans that were based on redevelopment in the Lothian Health Board's buildings were repeatedly frustrated, although eventually we had a measure of success in that the blood donor centre and some of the administrative functions were allocated to the street level of the building. And later on, we were able to use accommodation on that level to redevelop a better blood components processing facility.
And what impact do you think those accommodation difficulties, if I can describe them in those terms, had on the work of SEBTS?
It's, one lives with these things. I mean, speaking personally, it occupied a huge amount of my time because we had a constant, I realized that we had to find better accommodation. And that was before we saw the damning report from the inspectors. I spent a lot of time preparing bids, lobbying people in the health board, etc., trying to find a way forward, and trying also to negotiate with the Common Services Agency to recognise that substantial funding was required if we were to have accommodation that was reasonably fit for purpose. I think it affected the work of everyone in the service because they had to get used to sort of making do and mending with the accommodation. And I actually think it's a tribute to a lot of the people who worked there then that we managed to maintain an effective donor service, a good donor program, and we actually managed in this appalling accommodation to produce blood components. And to the best of my knowledge, we never experienced an episode of bacterial contamination, resulting in morbidity in a patient. But I think that was due, and the inspector acknowledged this in his report, to considerable dedication by the people who worked there.
Now, you've told us in your witness statement, if we just have that up on screen, WITN 6666001, page 16, please. You've told us there about Crown immunity. I just want to, we'll get the relevant paragraph up on screen, and then I'll ask you about that. So it's the third paragraph on the page. At the time of my appointment in 1979, my recollection is that SEBTS was covered by Crown immunity, and that it was the view of the SHHD, that's the Scottish Home and Health Department at that time, that SEBTS should not come under the remit of the Medicines Control Agency, then termed the Medicines Division of DHSS. By 1982, the situation had changed and SEBTS was inspected by the medicines inspector, Mr. David Haythornthwaite. Do you recall in the period from when you took over in 1979 through to the inspection in 1982, do you recall there being any active discussions then about the role of the Medicines Inspectorate? Because you've suggested there that the SHHD thought that there shouldn't be a role for at least the Medicines Division.
I personally don't have recollection of getting that personally from the Home and Health Department. My recollection is that Professor Cash was arguing strongly that BTS should come under Crown immunity, and there was considerable reluctance in the department because I suspect, for purely financial reasons, that they probably understood that that would lead to formal and binding inspections, which so that the service could only be maintained by spending large amounts of money. I may not be correct in what I've said here about the timing about the date when the Medicines Act came to apply to the blood transfusion service. I have a feeling it might have been later than that, and I don't recall seeing any documentation that gives me the date. But what I do recall is that in 1982, we had a sort of post-inspection briefing meeting, which is standard, with the inspector. And there was a medical officer from the Department of Health, I think probably representing the CMO, present at that meeting. And he was, I recall, very antagonistic to the implication in the inspector's report that a lot of money was going to have to be spent. And that was quite a heated meeting. I don't have a minute of that, unfortunately. It wasn't in the papers, and I can't research it myself. There will be a minute of that meeting, which you may have.
When you say it was a meeting with a medical officer from the Department of Health, do you mean from the SHHD or from the department? Yes, thank you.
Yes, it was the Dr. Moyer was the person concerned.
Now, if we can just look at the inspection report, it's at SBTS 0000407_007, please. We can see it's headed Visit to Edinburgh and South East Scotland BTS. We've got the dates of the visits there, 10th to the 11th of March and 10th to the 12th of May 1982. Two inspectors, Mr. Warburton and Mr. Haythornthwaite. And then paragraph 1 tells us that the centre's not been formally inspected before, that informal visits were paid in June and July 1981. There's then a description, sorry, if we just have the whole... Thanks. There's then a description, I don't need to go through the detail of it, about the difficulties in relation to split sites. The observation in paragraph 4 was that this split of locations would cause severe problems of supervision, communication and supply and should not be prolonged unnecessarily. Now, I'll come on in a few minutes to your formal response to this report, but do you have any observations on the inspector's concern there about the implications of having split locations for the centre?
Well, it was obviously inconvenient. I don't have a recollection that it actually caused particular... I think we were used to it. We coped with it.
And then if we look at paragraph 5, we've got there, but I think you probably accepted the fairly damning terms of the inspection report. This proved to be a difficult centre to inspect. This was caused partly by the considerable changes in progress. There is no doubt... Sorry, we lost the connection for a moment. Can you still see?
Yes, I've got it. Yes, I'm here.
Our screens here went blank for a couple of seconds, Doctor. Then it says, there is no doubt that the existing facilities for the processing and handling of blood are grossly deficient and would have been quite unacceptable. Therefore seems unreasonable to dwell unnecessarily on facilities which will only be used for 3 to 4 months. Equally difficult to assess a building which is still in the process of being refurbished. And then it refers to a further inspection being necessary. Did a further inspection take place as outlined here?
To be honest, I cannot remember, but I'm sure it did. There's certainly, it must have done, because somewhere very recently I've seen a document in which the inspector has expressed concerns about certain aspects of the interim building in Livingston House, which was referred to, and those were actually responded to by the relevant professionals in the building division. There are mainly issues about ventilation, so there must have been an inspection. I think there is actually a document referring to it in the papers that the inquiry has sent me, but I can't locate it obviously now.
No, neither can I, Dr. McClelland, but we can check that. And then paragraph 8 refers to the helpful attitude of staff. Then if we pick up at the bottom of the page, paragraph 10, the conditions under which blood is taken were explored a little more closely in that a local donor centre session was visited. The conditions themselves were adequate, but the following topics in particular were discussed. And then if we go to the top of the next page, I just want to highlight a couple of the paragraphs. 11A, the responsibility and the consistency of decision taken over which donors to accept or reject with regard to illnesses and medicines, and whether donors really read the questionnaire. Just how comprehensive is the questionnaire? We'll come back to that when we look at the response that that you provided to the report. And then B refers to the location of bleeding and type of donor. For example, whether prisons and borstalls were really appropriate or necessary as a source material. Again, I'll pick up with you later, Doctor, the collection of blood from prisons. The possible advantages of a mobile donor centre were also considered. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, paragraph 25 describes Edinburgh as a centre which appears to do a number of activities differently from elsewhere. The full significance and range of differences were not gone into due to the lack of time. And then if we go to the next page, we've got a list of staff I don't need to go through with you. And then we've got a list of medicinal products. Pooled fresh frozen plasma, pooled time expired plasma, cryoprecipitate, leukocyte depleted blood, red cell concentrates, platelet concentrates, Buffy Coates clinical fresh frozen plasma. And then the next paragraph reads about 60% of donations are for components and processing. The remainder is available for transfusions as whole blood. So is that an accurate description as at 1982 of the products that were being produced by the centre?
I think that's accurate, yes.
And then there's then a fuller description of the facilities over the page. I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but we've got there a full description of where in the different locations particular parts of the centre's work were located. Can I then ask you to, can we go to page 7, please? Just want to ask you about what's said there. So under the heading, paragraph 63, Thor-Siphon produced cryoprecipitate, discussions were held on the need for cryoprecipitate. The following reasons seem important. There is a reduced risk of contracting hepatitis from a small pool donor source. It is argued by others that the risk of contracting hepatitis is substantially increased when a pool exceeds 10. Edinburgh used an initial pool of 3, but this is later pooled with 4 other pools, making a total of 12 donors involved. The inspector would prefer the centre to investigate the possibility of using accredited donors in an attempt to reduce this risk. And then there are a number of other matters set out in relation to cryoprecipitate. Just in relation to those three paragraphs, Dr. McClelland, first of all, is that accurate in terms of the approach to pooling at Edinburgh in 1982?
It's not really. I think there was a certain amount of misunderstanding in the director's comments here, which I think are detailed in my response. But I can't remember the exact mechanics of the pooling arrangement, but I think when we come to the response, it's dealt with there.
I'll pick it up in a moment then when we look at the response. More broadly, however, would you accept and agree with what the inspector said at 64A, reduced risk of contracting hepatitis from a small pool donor source?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it slightly misses the point that the risk, there is a finite risk per donation. It's a probabilistic thing. So basically, the more donations an individual receives, the risk of anything, contracting any infection that happens to be present in some donations increases with the number. So whether it's 10 or 12 is going to make a marginal difference. There's nothing special about a pool exceeding 10 because the risk is proportional to the number of donors' blood that's in the pool. The other point, which is that the doses of cryoprecipitate were often required to be quite large, so multiple pools would be given. So an individual dose patient might get far more than 10 or 12 units. So this kind of misses the point.
So you would accept, I think, the broad proposition, would you, that in general terms, the smaller the pool, the lower the risk?
Well, no, because it depends on how many pools. If you have a pool of 3, but you need to give 10 of them to control a patient's bleeding, it's the same as giving a pool of 30. So I don't accept that. It's the dose, it's the total dose that matters.
Well, perhaps I may come back to this, Dr. McClelland, when we look at cryoprecipitate versus factor concentrates, which obviously wasn't the issue being considered by the inspector here.
It's an example of something that I've touched on elsewhere, which is this is focused entirely on the product, but if you focus on the patient, you have to think about how much they're getting.
And then if we can just go to page 9, bottom half of the page. Yes, SBTS 00000407_007, page 9. Bottom of the page. Just want to flag up, because I'm going to come back to it later, plasmapheresis, paragraph 97. The centre has a small 3-bed manual plasmapheresis programme going, and I want to ask you a little more about plasmapheresis in due course. And then if we just go to page 11, we can see in the second paragraph, existing facilities are quite inadequate and must rank amongst the worst seen anywhere. And then the inspectors say there remains a good deal of detail which was not explored due to lack of time. Now, as I mentioned and as you've referred to, the centre submitted a detailed response which we can see at WITN 6666017. Response to Medicines Inspector's report, 12th of January 1983. Do you know why the response was early the next year rather than being a more immediate response?
it took a very long time to prepare it. It was a complicated document, as you will have seen.
And then, if we go to the second page, under the heading Scope of the Report, the second paragraph, you say we've some difficulty with many of the inspectors' comments in relation to cryoprecipitate. To respond adequately would involve detailed discussion of many aspects of factor VIII therapy, which we feel relevant to the inspector's proper concern. Are you there alluding to the point that you were making a few minutes ago, Dr. McClelland?
Yes.
And then if we go to the next page, sorry, it's page 3 I need, Sally. Thank you. I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but you've got a heading accommodation and facilities, and then you've described the various changes, moves completed or further moves planned. Again, I don't propose to go through the detail, but they're set out there. And then if we go to page 5, we've got a heading blood donation. And this is where you set out your response to a number of the inspector's observations that we looked at a moment ago. So in response to the criticism of the inspectors about the consistency of decisions taken over acceptance or rejection of donors, raising the question of whether the donors read the questionnaire and whether it's sufficiently comprehensive, you say this: we share the inspector's concerns. The following actions have been taken. 1, a new comprehensive guide to donor selection has been prepared and is in routine use by donor selection staff. 2, we've made a trial of a comprehensive donor health questionnaire administered by donor staff. This has been abandoned as we do not have enough staff to operate it, and its use caused massive delays at donor sessions. 3, we've introduced as a routine for all donors a detailed health check questionnaire which is self-administered. Positive responses are followed up by interviewing the donor before donation. Donor compliance is good. This system will continue. An evaluation of its efficacy will be undertaken if sufficient staff become available to conduct the necessary follow-up interviews of donors who've completed the questionnaire. Do you have any recollection now, in any more detail, of what led you to share the inspector's concerns? In other words, what was happening on the ground about decision-making in relation to donors or donors reading or not reading the questionnaire?
I think what was happening, and probably to some extent still happens in all regional, all transfusion centres. It's extremely difficult to decide when somebody is completely healthy. It's relatively easy to decide when they're sick, but defining somebody who is actually fit enough to give a blood donation is a challenge. It involves people, and one can do the best one can with training people to take a reasonably standard approach. One can provide them with the most accessible information that you can, which hopefully gives clear and accurate and medically correct guidance as to what to do when you get a particular response from a donor. But beyond that, one is really very much dependent on being able to test for things that are wrong, that may be a hazard. We did actually, Dr. Gillen, I think, didn't mention this in his evidence, but he did an experiment, and I subsequently did another one using IT support. The first one was done with an early BBC computer, allowing donors to self-interview. And the results of that, I think, are published somewhere, was very encouraging. But we ran into great difficulties getting staff to accept it, and we would have had difficulty getting funds to make the organisational change to do that. And subsequent, some years later, I commissioned somebody to write the donor selection questionnaire using one of the very first handheld devices, made by Apple. And that also was very promising, but we had problems with unions, we had problems with staff numbers, with personnel and so on, and unfortunately had to abandon those. It remains a very difficult problem. Do patients read questionnaires? That, I think, do they really read them? That is a question that it's very difficult to answer in any context that you use a questionnaire. And do they understand them? The best that we were able to do, and it was later, was introduce personal donor interviews for all new donors, which at least meant a face-to-face interaction between a trained member of staff and the donor, which I still feel is probably the most likely to reveal a significant problem. But it remains a very difficult issue.
In terms of the donor sessions that would be being carried out at this time, 1982, 1983, obviously some would be in village centres and the like, and I'll ask you a little about that again in the course of the morning. But in terms of the donor sessions that were carried out at the centre, did the accommodation difficulties that you've described potentially impact upon the ability to have a relaxed yet thorough donor assessment process? If you've got cramped or not very hospitable surroundings, donors perhaps maybe less conducive to donors taking time to read and reflect upon the questions they're being asked?
Well, I think that unquestionably that was a limiting factor. And one specific thing was that there was no possibility of having a confidential discussion with anybody because everything was crammed into a small space.
Can we just have that document back on screen, Sally? WITN 6666017, page 5. Now, you'd identified in that paragraph 3 actions. The second action was the trial of the comprehensive questionnaire, but you explained there you had to abandon it as you didn't have enough staff. Presumably, if you had sufficient staff to operate it, that would have been a measure you'd have wanted to continue with.
Absolutely. We did come back to that later when Dr. Gillen introduced this later, I think for new donors, when we had better accommodation and more space. And I suspect our staff, although I can't remember the detail, I suspect our staffing numbers in the donor team had improved by that time. Now, that would have been the chosen option.
The other 2 options you identify here was the new comprehensive guide to donor selection and then a questionnaire for donors to complete themselves. And you refer to those being appended to this response. If we could just look briefly at them. Page 31 of this document, please. Now, I don't propose to go through this in detail, Dr. McClelland. It's headed Guide to Selection of Blood Donors. Is this the document that you were referring to?
No, what I was actually referring to was an alphabetical guide, which I think was also, it was submitted to the inspector, and I think it's attached to my copy of this report that was sent to me.
So if we just turn on a few pages.
Indeed, I think you'll get to it. This is sort of setting out the principles of it, but the problem that the donor attendants faced was they're not medically trained. So if somebody said, I've got thyrotoxicosis, or they used a colloquial name for a condition, I can't think of a good example, but, I've got a gastric stomach or something, as they will say in the west of Scotland, we needed a document that would give them not only the condition, but possible synonyms, so that they could at least identify whether that was something of which the donor attendant, him or herself, could make a decision, or whether they had to refer it to the medical officer.
And I think if we go to page 35 of this document, we'll see that. Alphabetical guide to medical assessment. And then if we go over the page, it's not a perfect copy, so we don't actually have the first letters, but we can see it is alphabetical, what looks like acupuncture, addiction, alcohol, allergy, and so on. So this was intended to be, was it of more practical use to the donor attendants in taking decisions about the donors?
Yes, and I think it has continued in the papers that the inquiry has. There are several versions of this, each of which has been updated with new information. And at the present, as far as I can recall, in the present procedure, a version of this is available online. I think the donor team have it on laptops at the sessions now, so it's much easier to search and probably has a good deal. I haven't looked at it, I must confess, but probably has a lot more information. You can see in this that I think that's Dr. Anne Smith's writing, that she was obviously doing a comparison exercise with other guidelines, whether they were, international, which would be ISBT, American Red Cross, etc., or whether there were some that were local, like the anemia thing.
And Dr. Anne Smith was this right? Dr. Gillen's predecessor, essentially. She was the donor consultant.
Yes, she was a fully qualified haematologist who I appointed soon after my own appointment, because I felt we needed somebody of that quality to deal with these really difficult problems of evaluating donors correctly.
Now, if we just turn on to page 47. We've got there, again, it's cut off on the left-hand side, but we've got there what would be hepatitis. It reads on the page as hepatitis. And the guidance there was to consult a doctor or sister, defer for 1 full year after recovery, check if the donor knows if he or she is a carrier for serum hepatitis, and if so, put off service. Otherwise, at their first donation 1 year after recovery, record hepatitis on donor's name slip and inform hepatitis lab. Now, I'll be asking you a little more about that again, Dr. McClelland, in due course, but can you just assist me with what the purpose was of recording hepatitis on the donor's name slip and informing the hepatitis lab?
I honestly can't remember, but I'm pretty sure it was a signal that the donation should be taken out of circulation. That was appeared to be placing that decision at the level of the testing lab, but that's the only reason I can think of for that instruction, but I honestly can't remember.
And then if we go to page 65, we have what I understand to be the questionnaire that was self-administered.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that what this is?
That's be the first version of it. Yes, it went through various iterations. I was always very unhappy with the fact that all the yeses were down one column and all the noes were down the other column, but I failed in repeated attempts to get them to change that. I was never happy with that questionnaire, I have to say.
And then it reads, a health check for new blood donors. Before we can accept you as a blood donor, we must make sure giving blood will do you no harm. We must also ensure the donation does not contain anything harmful to the patient receiving it, e.g. medicines or viruses. And then please answer these questions by ringing yes or no as appropriate. It will save you time when you're interviewed, and have your haemoglobin checked to make sure that you're not anemic. Now, What were you referring to there when you say when you're interviewed? Because as you've told us, the sort of the face-to-face interviews were a later, I think significantly later initiative. What kind of interviews are being referred to here?
Those face-to-face interviews were conducted by either a member of the medical staff or one of the senior nurses. This, I think, must refer to an interview, or probably fairly superficial interview, either with the person who was carrying out the hemoglobin check, who would have been one of the donor attendants, or with the donor attendant who was actually to perform the venisection, venipuncture, who would talk to the donor before inserting the needle. I don't have a clear memory, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's about.
And then can you assist with this? If we look, to start with, at the general questions, have you ever given blood before? What would be done with the answer? So if the answer to that was no, then presumably nothing. But if the answer was yes...
I think that was probably a question that was not really to do with the safety of the blood, but may have been inserted by the donor management people to, as part of their planning for, is a person likely to come back, or why did they stop giving, or I don't think it's related to blood safety.
And then, have you ever been rejected as a blood donor? Presumably that would be related to blood safety.
Absolutely. Or to the well-being of the potential donor.
And what would you expect to happen if that was ringed yes?
That would be referred to the medical officer, almost certainly, yes, because that would have to be investigated by direct discussion with the donor.
And then we can see on the right-hand side in C, screen for infection, you've got the question, have you had jaundice or hepatitis in the past 12 months? Screen for hepatitis contact, and then questions about ear piercing, acupuncture and tattoos. Again, were those assessments that the donor attendant would be expected to undertake if the answer was yes? Or would that be a matter for referral to whatever nursing or medical member of staff was on duty?
That would be specified in the alphabetical guideline. I think, for example, jaundice or hepatitis, I think the instruction to the donor attendant was refer that to the medical officer. Had your ears pierced would be a yes or no answer. There would be no need to refer that. Tattooing, I think, I'd have to look at the alphabetic, but that might well require a referral. Tattooing was a very contentious issue and came up repeatedly.
And then if we just go back in the alphabetical guide to page 43, the second item, all we can see there is use, but I think that must be a reference to drug abuse because there's an earlier...
Yes, it is.
It's in the Ds, and there's an earlier reference to drugs, saying see drug abuse. And so consult doctor or sister, and then we're told at least 6 months should elapse after the use of parenteral drugs because of the risk of serum hepatitis. Donors under the influence of oral drugs should not be accepted. What did that mean, or what did that refer to?
Well, even in '82, I guess there were narcotic drugs, not narcotic, drugs which could influence the mental state and be used improperly, which could be taken by mouth. So I think that's what's implied there. I can't actually now specify which tablet form drugs in 1982 would fall into that category, but I'm sure there were some.
And then it says, in both cases, bear in mind the possibility that the history given by these donors regarding the abuse of drugs may be unreliable. So,
yes, I think that the practice was pretty universal, that if somebody admitted to drug use, probably the donor attendants would not believe anything they said and probably would defer them. But that's recollection, and I couldn't document that.
because that's not what this says, of course, is it? This rather suggests that a past history of drug use, or drug abuse, misuse, or however you want to term it, would not lead to an automatic exclusion or deferment.
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the first paragraph, I think is, I would say definitely now was not correct. And I note that Dr. Jure had put international policy against it, but I'm quite uncomfortable with that. I thought that the use of parenteral drugs, I would have thought that was a permanent deferral. I think it probably is now a permanent deferral criterion, and I'm not quite sure how that got into this first draft. I'd have to look at later drafts to confirm that it's been changed.
And then if we just go back before we break, just so that we can finish this document, to page 5 of this document. We'd looked at what you had said there in relation to donor decision-making, and then the bottom of the page, this is in relation to prisons and borstalls. You say, we do not visit these regularly. No such sessions have been held for 2 years. Now, that, I think, in light of the evidence that you've subsequently given when putting together your evidence for Penrose and indeed for this inquiry, isn't correct, because you've identified, as I understand it, the last prison session being December 1981.
There is a discrepancy, I think, in two documents
Yes.
that SNBS supplied to the Penrose inquiry. One of them says 82 and the other says 81. Now, I believe that 81 is correct simply because I have very clear recollection of actually going to the archive filing cabinets myself and digging out the relevant donor session cards and checking the date from there. I have tried in preparation for giving evidence to locate the cards, because I'm told that they have not been destroyed, but nobody has been able to find them, unfortunately. So they're in an archive somewhere, but I was unable to extract them to check this. So the 1981 date is my recollection based on the fact that I personally remember looking at the cards and transcribing the information from them, but I could have got it wrong.
And then it says these donors will only be used in an emergency. So that does suggest that as at January 1983, when you were compiling or finalising this response, it was envisaged that there might still be blood taken from prisons, albeit I think your evidence is that didn't actually happen.
Well, it most definitely didn't happen, and I'm really quite surprised to see that statement there, because I'm absolutely clear that when I instructed the ending of the termination of those sessions, that I certainly had no intention that the teams would go back there under any circumstances. So I don't know why that has found its way into this response. But as to the very best of my knowledge, we never undertook any further sessions in any sort of penal institution.
And then, sorry, one very final reference in this document, if I may, sir. If we can go to page 18, this is just dealing with the question of cryoprecipitate. Paragraph 65 sets out in a little more detail, I think, the point that you have already made. And then if we can go to the next paragraph, I just wanted to ask you about one matter. So this is in response to the suggestion of the inspector that you could use accredited donors for the production of cryoprecipitate. And you've said this because the triple pool is selected from donations of known group, i.e. from established donors. There's already an element of accreditation in the procedure. I didn't quite understand that, Dr. McClelland. What do you mean from donations of known group, i.e. from established donors?
Well, we had to make the cryoprecipitate from donations that we knew were Group A or Group O, basically. To know that, we would only know that about a donor if they had given previously, because their blood would have been grouped routinely as part of the routine testing process. And the fact that they had given before meant that we at least had a negative hepatitis B test, and we would presumably not have had any reports of problems in the recipients. But that's a different issue which we can come on to.
So a first donation from a new donor would not be used for the production of cryoprecipitate?
No. I mean, we actually, the inspector didn't really define what he meant by accredited, and it can mean all sorts of things. But that's why actually we say that here. We're not clear how an accredited donor should be defined in terms of the risk of transmitting hepatitis. So I think that's quite clear.
So I've finished finally with this document. So perhaps now we should take a break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break then until 5 to 12. So 5 to 12.